done if plants take certain steps. So the reason I'm here today is because Inform is embarking on a project whose goal is to promote soil production. We chose the state of Louisiana because of all of the factors all of you are already very familiar with in terms of environmental degradation and the extent of the chemical industry, but also because one way to really promote source reduction, probably the most appropriate way in this state, is through the grassroots. And Louisiana certainly has one of the most organized and fired up community groups or community organizations that I'm aware of. As a matter of fact, in a recent issue of Chemical and Engineering News, which is a chemical industry trade journal, they said that they said that Louisiana's grassroots groups were the most organized in the state, in the whole country. So that's coming from the industry. You guys should be very proud of that.
I don't believe anything the chemicals.
So I don't know if each one of you got a copy of the handout. Is there anyone that didn't get something that I just handed out? Okay. I just wanted to give everyone kind of a synopsis of what it is that this project is aiming to do, and that we won't have to write so much down. Anyone else? Even one left over. So the project that we're doing has three main phases. The first thing we have to do before we even start the first phase is to identify two, maybe three community groups in the state that are interested in building a bridge with one or more plants in their area, sitting down and talking about source reduction and trying to assess to what degree that plant is really making progress in source reduction. And then with that assessment, agree on a continuing monitoring system. I don't mean monitoring of actual waste coming out of stacking things, but monitoring of to what extent they have programs in place that is focused on source reduction. So the reason I'm here at this particular conference is because I think a lot of community leaders are here, and at this particular workshop, I'm hoping that those that are interested in technical assistance might come forward and want to engage in this particular exercise. The three phases of this project, which is outlined in this first sheet that I handed out. The first phase is source reduction training. Basically what we will do is take the case studies that we have put together, which is a total so far of 181 separate source reduction activities that a group of 29 organic chemical plants around the country is taking. What kind of waste were reduced, what kind of costs were involved, what kind of cost savings, what sort of environmental effects, what kind of effects it had on productivity. And one thing that was very key is what kind of program did this company have in place that helped it identify and implement all these opportunities in the first place. I'll get a little bit more into that later, but that's what the first phase will cover. And as this says here, if appropriate, we can call in another nonprofit organization in Washington that has a computerized system, a personal computerized system. I mean, it can be run on your own computer if you have one, that can do a risk assessment based on whatever kind of environmental information, if you have a soil contamination, air contamination, and such, and take that information and sort of come up with a ballpark figure of what kind of risk you all are being exposed to. And for this first phase, we'll be using basically two of our publications. The first one is called Cutting Chemical Waste. It came out in 1985, and it was the first look at these 29 organic chemical plants. It ranged in size and type of products that they produce and type of processes they use and ownership, whether it's foreign or domestic, whether it's large facilities or small facilities or a company with a lot of plants or just one plant. And the study that I mentioned before that's coming out in 2 weeks is a follow-up to that study. We went back, starting in 1987, to those same 29 plants to see if they had made any kind of further progress. And that study will look something like this, but this is just a Xerox copy. It won't come back from the printer till next week, but will then be released. And this is the book that will have all the information on those 181 specific source reduction activities. The book will actually be selling for $75, but, oh, no, there's no fee. But since I already started mentioning it, the book is $75, but we have a policy for community and nonprofit groups that nothing is more than $10 or $15. So either, we can get the book to you. Well, if you're part of the technical assistance, we're just going to give the book to you. But I mean, in general, the community group wants to order the book. Nothing, this book or any other book in the public is not more than $10 or $15, I forget, for a community or nonprofit organization.
Mark, if I want to volunteer, what would be involved?
Okay, let me just go through these 3 steps and then. The second phase will be actually doing a plant visit to a plant or more than one plant in your area that you are concerned about as to what extent they are achieving source reduction. Now, it'll be your role to organize that meeting, to contact the facility, to set up the meeting with the people that you think should be there. I will also participate. And at that meeting, we will sit down and use a questionnaire in the Citizens Guide that we put out, which we'll also give to you, which I made copies of the actual questionnaire as part of this, which we'll get to. We will have a meeting, and they usually take 3 or 4 hours from my experience. Not that we've done this with community groups before, but this is the same thing we did in our research for the books that we put out. So 3 or 4 hours to really establish a rapport and then get specific information on these program features. And I'll get into more detail about what kinds of program features I'm talking about. And then the third phase will be a result of this meeting, which the company will provide the community group with information on some regular basis, whether it be a matter of months or once a year or whatever, on the progress made in establishing these program features, improving on the program features they already have, and on progress made in actually reducing waste, what kind of waste they reduced, how they reduced it, how much it cost, how much it saved, that sort of thing. Inform will step back from there and will be available as a resource for your questions and comments. If you want to send us a copy of what the plant has sent you, we'll review it. But basically, our thought is to come in, give you the knowledge that we have about source reduction techniques and about programs. Join you in an initial discussion with plant officials, and then the plant officials and the community group will then take it from there, and Inform would be available for comment and such. So it means that the community group has to be sufficiently organized and have enough time and a commitment to follow through with the organization and implementation of this. So that's very important to understand. The second page here is an attempt I did to kind of give you a quick and dirty training on source reduction. And what I tried to do was make it somewhat non-technical and very easy to understand. So I called it the 3 A's of source reduction. avoiding, achieving, and anchoring. That means avoiding the creation of waste in the first place, achieving results from implementing source reduction, and then anchoring source reduction as a cornerstone of the plant's environmental protection and community health protection strategy by adopting certain program features. So taking the first step, avoiding creation of waste in the first place, there's basically 5 types of techniques that would fall under the definition of source reduction. And these 5 techniques that will avoid creating waste in the first place. We're not looking at how you can take waste and recycle it, no matter how environmentally sound that recycling can be. Not how you can treat it, not how you can dispose of it. Not that those aren't important things, but this particular effort is focused on source reduction, on not creating waste. So the first one is avoiding operational and maintenance practices. So to give you an example of what operational and maintenance practices are, an Exxon plant that we looked at in New Jersey was able to reduce thousands of pounds of air emissions and save about $200,000 a year by simply installing floating roofs on about 16 of its chemical storage tanks. Another plant, an American cyanamide plant, this one is in Ohio, simply took wherever it could its quality control samples, where it was taking quality control of its raw materials when it was coming in, or samples of material in the middle of a production phase, or samples of product before it was being loaded to be shipped off-site. And after testing it for quality, instead of throwing it out and allowing it to become waste, handling it in such a way that it wouldn't become contaminated so that you can put it back into the process again. They were able to reduce 90% of the waste that they had otherwise generated before that way. There was nothing high-tech before. There was nothing that kept them from having done that 10, 20 years ago. And this is very typical of the types of source reduction activities that we have found. A lot of it is there waiting to happen. The second type are opportunities to replace or install new equipment. I'm sorry, that Exxon example I gave you before about the floating roofs, that was an example of equipment changes. The Exxon example of operational changes that I wanted to share with you was, in this particular Exxon facility, they use batch processing. Batch processing means they get their raw materials together, they make a product, the stuff mixes around, it creates a product, they get the product out the end of the pipe, the equipment shuts down, they clean it off, start again. That's as opposed to continuous processing. Continuous processing just keeps going. They just keep putting in the raw materials, it keeps mixing together, and the product just keeps coming out, and they don't have to keep cleaning it time and time again. Batch processing is usually used when you're making a lot of different products, or when your orders are such that you get certain orders for products, you make them, and you ship it out, and you wait till you get another order and such. So batch processing can be much more waste intensive because you have to keep cleaning out your equipment, and every time you clean the equipment out, you're creating a lot of waste. So one very simple thing that Exxon did was it changed its scheduling of products. It looked to see how often it was making one particular product, or a series of products that would not necessarily be contaminated if they made them one after the other. In other words, they were scheduling their products so that they did not have to clean the equipment out every time they did a batch. Again, a very simple, very straightforward thing. It just took an effort on their part saying, how can we reduce waste? And it's amazing how many plants do not stop to ask themselves that question. Exxon was able to reduce 7.5 million pounds of waste per year that it was otherwise generating from the old scheduling system that it used. And it saves $1.2 million a year because of all of the waste that it's not generating. It doesn't have to treat it, doesn't have to ship it, and other types of waste-related costs. Another example of an equipment change is at a Rome Palenque facility, also in New Jersey, where they were creating a certain chemical that then had to be dried. And in the drying process, they used to lose a lot to the air. What they simply did was get a condenser to capture what was going to the air, cool it down so they could capture it, and then sell it as product. So not only were they reducing waste, they were increasing their product yield. They were making their product process more efficient because more of their raw material was being converted to product. They were getting more product for every pound of raw material that they were putting in. Another example of an equipment change is an Aristech facility in Ohio, which simply added more reactors to a certain process that they were already using. Basically what that did, their raw materials would come in, it would go into a reactor, it would be in there for a certain amount of time, and within that time, so much of the raw material would react with each other to become a product. So what they did was they added another reactor on there, so that the material went from one reactor then into another, basically doubling the time that the raw materials could be in contact with each other. So again, more of the raw material was ending up as a product, improving their efficiency. They were able to also reduce 7 million pounds of waste per year that they were otherwise generating with the old process, and save $2.4 million a year, just because they were improving their yield. And the same amount of raw material, they were now selling $2.4 million more worth of that product. The next are process changes. The third type of source reduction technique is process changes. That's where you just change the process conditions so that things are happening more efficient. So for one example, a Dow facility in California. This facility, first of all, makes chlorine, then takes that chlorine and reacts it with various kinds of hydrocarbons to make perchloroethylene and carbon tetrafluoride, other very nasty things, but they're doing it in somewhat of a more efficient way. That kind of touches on another issue, which I'm not going to go into in too much depth right now, but that is, once companies are as efficient as they possibly can be, then you kind of have to ask yourself and ask them, do we need these products in the first place? Do we need carbon tetrafluoride or chloroethylene in the first place? But that's something we can get back to at some other time. But what Dow did, when they would react this chlorine with these hydrocarbons, they would get hydrochloric acid gas off as a waste product. What they used to do was take sodium hydroxide, or caustic, and put it in contact with this gas to capture all the hydrochloric acid. And by doing that, you're producing brine, or sodium chloride. But because the hydrochloric acid that was in the gas and the sodium hydroxide were so concentrated, you were forming not only brine, but also an impurity. And this impurity made it impossible to take this brine and bring it back to another process in their plant from which they produced the chlorine in the first place. They had to take this brine with this impurity and send it to evaporation ponds on their site, let all the water evaporate off. Everything else left would be sludge or solid waste, and they'd have to dispose of it. So what they did, they made a very simple change. Instead of taking this acid gas waste and cleaning it with this sodium hydroxide, they first just cleaned the stream with water. What that did, the water then captured the hydrochloric acid. You would get a concentrated enough hydrochloric acid solution that it could then be either sold as hydrochloric acid product or be used somewhere else in the plant as a raw material. What the water was not able to capture, they would then use the sodium hydroxide, but now that the concentration was lower, there was no more of that impurity. All of the sodium hydroxide that was contacting whatever hydrochloric acid was left was converted to brine. All the brine could then be sent back to the chlorine unit, where brine is a raw material. In other words, they were now producing no waste from that process. They were able to close the evaporation ponds, which had been collecting 12 million pounds a year of waste. It cost them about save over $2 million a year in avoided waste-related costs and what they're getting now from selling the hydrochloric acid and from having to use less brine from somewhere else as a raw material. Also, it took only 4 months to make this change. This wasn't something that was going to take 10 years of research and development. And that's another very typical finding that we saw from source reduction. Most of the source reduction activities that the plants that we looked at were implemented in an average of 8 months. And that's very short term in terms of industry thinking. The last 2 types of source reduction activities usually tend to be a little bit more resource intensive. One is chemical substitution, the other is product reformulation. Chemical substitution is where you're taking a currently used raw material that is toxic or hazardous and finding something that's non-toxic or non-hazardous to do the same thing. The other one is product reformulation, where you're either just reformulating your product, such as a paint maker, who instead of making solvent-based paints, is now making water-based paints, so now there's no need for solvents. Or you completely change your product. There was one company that used to make a resin out of formaldehyde and urea, and now they make a resin that forms the same or serves the same purpose, but is made of formaldehyde and melamine. In our study, though, 87% of all of those 181 source reduction activities were of the first 3 kinds. That means there were the easy kinds, the ones that did not involve a lot of research and development. It was just basically ways that you could take, that they could take the raw materials that they were currently using and more efficiently convert them into products that they were already producing. And what our research shows is that the opportunities just don't seem to end. The more a company looks for ways to reduce waste by these easy, fast, cost-saving means, the more they find. One argument that industry used to give a lot, and you'll probably find that they still do once we start asking questions, is they say, well, you know, we've done all the source reduction that we possibly can. But those plants that we've looked at that actually have source reduction programs that are aggressively looking for their opportunities continue to find them. In this book that's just coming out, we have graphs that show on a timeline basis amount of waste reduced. And it's not that you see in the early years a lot of waste and then as the years go on it goes down. You see continuing big spikes all the way to the present time. They just continually find more and more opportunities. And that's something that you've got to keep in mind when you're talking with these plants. That none of the plants that we looked at said that they had thought that they had reached the limit or that there even was a limit for source reduction.
Mark, from this recent study, have you been able to tell how many of this set of plant managers are seeing waste reduction as an economic value to the company in terms of this is going to increase their profits? Is that mindset there, or is that concept there?
The mindset is there once they've done the source reduction, for the most part. It's not that that was the incentive to do the source reduction in the first place. Most of the incentives were compliance-oriented or waste disposal cost-oriented. The cost of sending waste to a landfill or to an incinerator was getting so high that then the companies would say, where is this waste coming from in the first place? Or environmental regulations were making it more difficult for the old treatment and disposal route. Either options for landfills were closing, or waste that was being sent to a sewage treatment plant. The sewage treatment plant was telling a company, well, you know, you're sending us 10 million pounds of chemical X. We can no longer accept that much. You've got to cut it down. And there were many plants that still did not look for source reduction opportunities as the first cut. They looked for more ways to treat and dispose, either building evaporation ponds or getting some kind of high-tech system very often, even though there's all this evidence, not just our studies, but studies by the Office of Technology Assessment, the Congressional Office, other academic institutions have been doing case studies on source reduction for years, for the last 10 years. And time again, you see these economic benefits. But one of the barriers that we have seen, that we have uncovered from our studies of source reduction, well, the main barrier is institutional. Source reduction saves money. It's very often very easy technology, and there are no regulations that are standing in the way of it. If anything, regulations are kind of pushing companies to finally look for it. It's the institutional changes that are standing in the way. Companies have been doing business for decades, and when they first started, environmental costs were irrelevant to them. It was very cheap to send something to a dump, so they were making a profit, and it's very difficult to get people to change. This is the way they've been operating. They've had a mentality focusing on waste as being an end-of-pipe kind of thing. You don't look at what's happening in your process, where the source of the waste is. You know it's coming out of the tailpipe, and then you got to either dump it somewhere or burn it or just somehow get rid of it. And that's quite an obstacle to get companies to change. So even though there are all of these case studies, there are some plans that are picking up the message that source reduction is an economic gain. It's a win-win type of situation. One plant that we looked at, well, the studies that we did were two-phased. We did the study, came out with a report in 1985, and went back to those same plants again starting in 87. One plant that we looked at was a Fisher Scientific plant in New Jersey. And Fisher Scientific makes a lot of specialty chemicals for use in school laboratories and things like that. And they use batch processing. They make a certain batch, and they clean everything out and make something else. And they make hundreds of products. When we went there the first time in about 1983, the plant manager there told us, we make too many products, we have all these batches, there's no way that we can track all of our materials and find out where the waste is coming from. When we went back in 1987 or 88 to that plant, there was a new plant manager there. He had invested $1 million in a computerized tracking system. That plant now, or at the time of our study, uncovered and implemented more opportunities for source reduction than any other plant that we've looked at. Because that plant manager realized that there were economic gains to be made by improving efficiency and doing it right the first time.
That might be why he got the job, huh?
Well, he's no longer there, but I don't know what went into that. Well, there are a lot of factors that go into employment at a facility, so somehow I doubt that that's the reason he got the job. I think once he came into the job, as a matter of fact, I'm not sure I can make this link, but I know that when we first contacted that plant, and we met with the plant manager, and we gathered information, and he had put the information that we got into a very nice, tabular, very easy to understand form. For every source reduction activity they told us about, we gave a little description, the type of waste reduced, the amount of waste reduced, how much it cost, how much it changed product yield, how much was spent, what the motivating factor was, how long it took. And we sent that back along with a written profile that was made of each plant, to each plant for their comments. And this plant manager told us that he then took that table that we had put together and used it at his board meetings to show what kind of progress they had made. And then from that time on, he modified the computer system so it automatically collected all that information. I mean, you would think that this is what companies would do from day one, but it's just amazing how much is not done. The middle part of this section, which is called the achieve results, I just gave an overview of what kind of results we did find. And basically, the source reduction activities affected all kinds of waste, whether they were air emissions, wastewater, or solid waste. An average of 70% reduction of the waste stream that was hard by that source reduction activity. And the reason I make that very clear is because I don't mean that 70% of all the waste from that facility was reduced. The waste that that source reduction activity targeted was reduced 70%. It's still very impressive, but it's just important to make that technical detail. Over half of the source reduction activities reduce waste between 90 and 100%. On average, it was 70%, but half of them reduced between 90 and 100%, which I find just phenomenal. 90 to 100%. And 29% of all of them completely eliminated the waste stream. And this and the other data that I will be sharing with you is what I think can be used as a basis along with background information on the plan to say, look how powerful source reduction is. Look what all these other plants have done. What can you show us you have done to reduce waste at the source? As I said, 87% were simple technologies. Only 13% were the chemical substitution and product reformulation types. 97% of the activities that we could determine what kind of effect it had on product yield increased product yield. And that's a very important point to make to industry too. Source reduction is improving your competitive stance. It's making your operations more efficient. And of the ones that gave us numerical, it was about a 7% increase in product yield. It ranged from about a 0.05 increase to 40% increase in product yield. On average, whatever capital costs were involved were paid back within about 13 months. 2/3 were paid back in 6 months, and about 1/4 didn't even require any capital investment in the first place. And when you talk about 13 months or 6 months, that's very short term in industry management perspective. Altogether, these companies continue to save over $20 million a year because of the source reduction that they implemented, whether it's because they're no longer having to spend money on treating these wastes that were created, or they are more efficiently using their raw materials so they can purchase fewer raw materials in the first place, or they're getting more product from the same amount of raw materials so their sales are increasing. All those factors together go into this $20 million. And as I said before, they're all implemented in an average of about 8 months. And we also look not just at what kind of source reduction actions they were taking, but what kind of programs that they implemented that were really going to help them identify their opportunities. So under this anchor source reduction, there are 6 of these source reduction program features, and it's these 6 features that the questions that you would be asking industry are based on. Number 1 is, are you accounting for the cost of waste back to the source? Because the cost of waste, any kind of environmental cost, was usually just overhead of the whole facility. So there was no incentive for operations managers who may or may not have known how much waste was coming from their particular process to reduce waste in terms of cost, because nobody knew how much their process was contributing to the overall cost, because they were just on overhead costs. And in order to account back to the source, you have to know what the source is. So you have to have some sort of materials tracking system. As I mentioned, that Fisher plant had a computerized tracking system. But they don't all necessarily have to be a fancy computerized system. It can just be a simple routine walk through a plan to follow where the wastes are being generated. Is there leadership at the plant? Is somebody at a high level responsible for source reduction? And what our study found was that when a plant had an environmental person and an operations person together responsible for source reduction, they had about 2.5 times more source reduction achievement than those plants that did not.
5 minutes.
500.
Isn't it a shame?
Yes. They do policy states that source reduction is the #1 strategy before recycling, treatment, and disposal? Do they have source reduction goals? And very importantly, are they involving their employees from management to the plant floor workers in understanding source reduction, in coming up with source reduction ideas, and actually implementing them? Because unless, just like involving grassroots community people in what's happening in the community to really get something done, you have to tap all of the workers in a facility, make them part of the whole process, and reward them. Either give them recognition with an actual award, which some plants do, give them a percentage of the savings as a result of the source reduction they came up with, or even something is giving them a parking space that's really close to the door, which we've also seen in some plants. Some sort of recognition. I guess I don't have time to go over it. I'm sorry, I guess I talked too much, but you do have in your hand the questionnaire, and it goes in more detail into each one of those program areas I just talked about. And this is the kind of questionnaire that will be used when we sit down with facility managers, and would also be the basis of some ongoing monitoring that would be agreed between the plant and the community group. You would see, are they developing a policy? Are they developing a system of tracking materials through their plant to identify sources of waste? Are they accounting for waste back to the source? Do they have a program of training and involving and rewarding their employees? Are they setting goals, etc.? Because if they don't have these things, they are not going to be finding all of their opportunities. And if they tell you, we've reduced everything that we can, if they don't have all of these things, then you can be sure that they are not achieving all the source reductions that they have the potential to do. And with the examples that I gave you, it shows that there are many opportunities just waiting to happen. You just need the management to say, let's go find them and implement them. I guess I'll take questions, but before I do, I just hope that with this very, you just touched on the tip of the iceberg here, but if this kind of dialogue and assessment is of interest to you, or to a community group that's not represented here but that you know of, please bring that to my attention, because in order to make this really happen, we've got to find a group that's really anxious to see this happen. So thank you, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
We all know that some industries in Louisiana have been involved in reduction of their hazardous waste emissions and deep well injection of hazardous waste. I read recently in an article that all the major petrochemical industries in the U.S. were trying to dream up ways to avoid all generation of hazardous waste. And I thought, wow, that sounds like that's totally off base and inaccurate based on my involvement with trying to get the American Cyan request for new injection wells permit denied, and they wouldn't hear of more easy, simple, cheap ways for source reduction of voluminous parts of the waste stream.
As I said, it's very hard to change habits that have been going on for a long time. The toxics release inventory and other types of publicly available databases are helping in getting these quantities out into the public and into newspapers and such, that plants like American Cyan may get to be #1 or #2 in the country in terms of waste. But in lieu of lack of other legislation or programs in the state, putting community pressure on the plant and
should mention also that I did have the opportunity to speak to one of the plant managers later on because of a panel that one of our participants here, Mary Gandolini, with Women for a Better Louisiana, set up with an LCA representative and a plant manager of American Cyanamid, which he told me, after I faced him down on this issue, that she was coming on really strong on the panel, but when I said, and I called him on a couple of things, he said, well, you know, I think you've got a good point, and it maybe would be a good idea for you to talk to some of our board members and tell them you want the managers to do more to minimize waste. So there is some receptiveness, even at a major waste generator like that. And the managers do not have the real power there. The board members do, and they're saying to us, look, if you could exert some pressure to the board who has the power, might help.
Well, you're right, the plant managers don't always have the authority and the power to make changes themselves. But we do find that they are the good contact person to make at the plant. And if, in the case of American Cyanamid, the plant manager himself suggests you contact the board, I wonder if there's some way that he could be effective in actually initiating contact between your group and the board. Have you looked into that?
I did not follow up on that. I'm pretty thinly spread on the issues I've been working on. And I'm sure that that's a possibility to try to contact some board members there. That they have done some to subsequently reduce or show the reduction in figures of their injection wastes.
Well, showing reduction in figures in the currently available databases aren't necessarily source reduction. That's
why I phrased it
yeah,
in that way.
That's why it's important at this point to have this kind of dialogue. Starting in 1991, or with 1991 data, the toxics release inventory will be collecting information that is amount of waste generated prior to recycling, treatment, or disposal, which it was not doing before. So that will make it a little bit easier, although the toxics release inventory still has some limitations. But I'd be happy to talk to you further if you think that there might be some way that we can be involved.
Sure, and not just with that industry, but I'm sure there's other industries in Louisiana that might be help to see the light on how they can save money. Maybe impress their boards of directors or vice versa.
I mean, there's
To
a lot
show
of
a good
economic
green face to the public.
there's a lot of economic data that's just out there on source reduction, and that's very effective with boards.
Alan, how do you feel about recycling hazardous waste under the auspices of
Well, I'm not familiar with that if it's a specific law you're talking about, but
Well, I understand somewhere it's in either RCRA or BICRA, but I've read articles on New York Attorney General had demonstrated.
well, maybe we can talk about that afterwards, because I'd like to keep the focus on source reduction.
You mentioned TRI information. What do you think, or how close are we to closing the recycling loophole as it's addressed in the Sikorsky legislation?
Well, Sikorsky is asking for more than the new Form R, which is the reporting form that the toxic waste inventory actually has on it now. The state of New Jersey familiar with the right to know reporting that's required in New Jersey, but that's going much further than the federal level, and it's very close to what Sikorsky is asking for. When that would ever be collected on the federal level is anybody's guess.
It'll be a pretty heated debate, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Is this
But
initiative-
they have made progress from the old form. It's only good until November. OMB has written something in there that they review it again in November. But as it stands now, it's got information in it that you can add up to figure out for that particular chemical how much was generated as waste to air, water, and land prior to recycling of any kind, including energy recovery. Treatment and disposal.
There's an initiative in Ohio as well addressing toxic labeling.
If you want a 5-minute break, you need to wrap it. Oh, Then we
Thank you.
need to be back here in 5 minutes.
Undaunted person. He and Linda King first met them when they came to Alexandria one time for a meeting. And they stood there and shook in their shoes, having to talk to the people that we meet with every day. The strange part was there was only one door out, and everybody from Waste Management was between us and the door. So it does make it scary. But I do want to thank Will for being here. We consider him one of our own. So when he leaves, he's leaving home, and when he comes back, he's coming back home. That's what we feel about it, and we hope he does too. Will Collette.
Yeah, I actually hate using microphones too. Can everybody hear me okay?
It's okay.
It's nice to see a lot of new faces, and it's also nice to see a lot of my old friends from the time I spent at the Citizens Clearinghouse for Hazardous Waste. For those of you who are, I hope, new friends, just to briefly introduce myself, I basically have a split personality where about half of my time is spent working with citizens organizations in America's coal fields through an association called the Citizens Coal Council, which is fighting for the right to have your water replaced if coal mining destroys it, the right to have your home replaced if it should happen to collapse in somebody's coal mine, which, much to a lot of people's shock and amazement, is not protected under law. If a coal mine digs under your home and your water disappears, your house disappears, it's your tough luck. And we're fighting to change that. And in fact, we might need your help real soon in dealing with that, because we just won a major victory 2 days ago when the National Energy Bill was passed in the House, containing language that protects people's homes and water supplies in the coal fields. And it's going to go to conference committee where they negotiate what the final bill is going to look like. And guess who we're going to be bumped up against in the Senate? Bennett Johnston. Okay, and we're going to need some help with getting the message to Bennett that even though we know he's going to protect his pals in the coal and the oil industry, that maybe he might cut some slack for folks in Appalachia and the rest of the coal fields who have been suffering without protection for generations. The other half of my job, and the main reason why I'm here, is that I work also as the Washington Outpost. Washington representative is my official title for a regional association of grassroots organizations like LEAN out in the West, called the Western Organization of Resource Councils. And their top priority, and my reason for coming and visiting with you this weekend, is the fight for the right to say no to out-of-state waste. How many of you have been sort of tracking that issue, following it? About half and half. Okay. Let me just give you the short form of background on that. And Hubert, I'm going to have to violate the rule about acronyms, because unfortunately I'm from Washington and I'm here to baffle you. Yeah, there's this law that's supposed to be the basic national policy about dealing with waste in this country, and it is called RCRA. Let me play Mr. Rogers. Can you all say RCRA? RCRA. We use it as a chant out in the West. When we play volleyball, it sort of gets people pumped up to, it's an interesting mantra. We're weird in the West, what can I tell you? It's the high altitude. Resource Conservation and Recovery Act is what that stands for. Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. It expired in 1988. Like most laws, it takes Congress about 4 or 5 years to get around to dealing with things. I mean, so they're late, 4 years, so sue me, right? They're getting around to doing a process called reauthorization. And in Washington, you never use 2 syllables when you can use 6 or 7. Reauthorization basically means to renew this bill. In this bill are all of the rules and regulations, or the laws that create the rules and regulations around both hazardous waste and municipal solid waste. Now, when I was still working at the Citizens Clearinghouse for Hazardous Waste, I worked mainly with folks like yourselves, you know, fighting to either shut down facilities that are destroying your communities or keeping facilities out that are going to destroy your communities. And we did, both here and elsewhere, the logical thing, which is we got people talking to each other who had common problems. And the natural consequence of that was that people started looking at a few of the larger causes of the misery they were all suffering. And in a number of states, people combined their efforts and won state laws, or they got their governors to issue executive orders that said, you can't bring out-of-state garbage in here anymore. You know, very much like the state's been trying to deal with that mess that's been coming over from Texas going into Monroe, right? What they discovered, which was a surprise to all of us, is that there is this thing in the United States Constitution called the Interstate Commerce Clause, which is in Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution. And what Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution says is that only Congress can regulate interstate commerce. And according to the United States Supreme Court, garbage is commerce. I don't so much look at it as commerce, I look at it as like a problem. But the US Supreme Court in 1978, in a lawsuit that is that goes by the name of Philadelphia versus New Jersey, the United States Supreme Court created what we've come to call the Dumper's Bill of Rights. And what that means essentially is that waste management has a greater constitutional right to haul waste across state lines and dump it on you than you have to stop them. Now, there are a lot of us who figured that's not very nice, not very fair, and at the 1989 National Grassroots Convention hosted by CCHW, a resolution was passed. In fact, my vivid memory of that, and a number of you were at that convention, was that that was probably the most energized resolution that came out of the whole convention. It was like, we've got to get this damn thing out of here. The Dumper's Bill of Rights has got to go. We've got to get this thing repealed. And that was in 1989.
The dumpers have a right to do what?
The US Supreme Court has held that waste management has the right to haul across state lines, and that state and local governments may not interfere with that right. Only Congress, according to the United States Supreme Court, Philadelphia versus New Jersey, US Supreme Court 1978 says, only Congress can regulate the interstate waste trade. 6 months after the convention, a fellow from Indiana by the name of Dan Coates introduced a bill in Congress that came to be known as the Coates Amendment, that got attached to an appropriations bill for the District of Columbia and the Senate passed the bill by a vote of 67 to 33. And that bill was about 2 pages long, and it basically said that the states hereafter have the right to tax, ban, or otherwise regulate as they see fit the interstate trade of garbage. Passed by a vote of 67-33. Now, I was still at CCHW. We were still sort of tired after the convention, and we were sort of sitting around. We had nothing to do with this thing being introduced. I'm not going to take any credit for it or whatever. It was very much a spontaneous thing that arose out of Indiana, where Dan Coates happens to be a United States Senator, having been appointed to replace Dan Quayle when Quayle became vice president. Dan Coates is an ultra right-wing Republican who was chief of staff for Dan Quayle before he got appointed to be senator. But he happens to be the best guy in the United States Senate on our issue, thus proving Saul Alinsky's old motto that there are no permanent allies and no permanent enemies. No permanent allies, no permanent enemies. Everything is subject to what have you done for me lately. I looked at that and said, boy, this is wonderful. Without lifting a finger, we are getting the most important part of our platform enacted. Boy, life is good. We're really doing great. And then the thing sort of dropped off the map. At CCHW, we don't get involved in legislative stuff. We never considered that to be all that important. We dealt with the grassroots and the whole bottoms-up rising that's been taking place over the past 12 years. The bill disappeared. In the meantime, I changed jobs. I figured after 10 years at CCHW, I was ready for a change, and I went to my first meeting on February 2nd of '91 of a thing in Washington called the RCRA Working Group, which is basically the National Environmental Lobby. All of the major national organizations have, who have lobbyists in Washington, have a person or two that sits within this RCRA Working Group to try and figure out what the national strategy is going to be to get RCRA renewed. And I'm sitting there, my second day in the new job, and I'm listening to my new colleagues talking about how they needed to form a united platform on RCRA so that they could avoid legislative mischief. Legislative mischief, legislative mischief. We need to form a united platform to avoid legislative mischief. And I'm sitting there going, legislative mischief? I wonder what they're talking about. I like mischief. I don't care much for legislative. So am I for or against this? Or is legislative mischief, the two words combined, like a contradiction in terms? I couldn't figure it out until about an hour or so into the meeting where somebody said, yeah, so that we don't have to deal with legislative mischief like the Coates Amendment. And I sat there and I went, whoa, what are we talking about here? Why are you calling the Coates Amendment, which is probably the most important thing to the grassroots movement, to all of us, who have to deal with scumbags like Waste Management, Browning Ferris, and Laidlaw, and the rest of these jerks day after day? Why are they referring to a law that would put these guys in a bad spot as legislative mischief? So I asked the question, hey guys, what's your problem with the Coates Amendment? And they gave me a sort of strange look like, how did you get into the club? Who approved your credentials, Jack? And then they answered my question about why they don't like the Coates Amendment. Answer number one, this is not a David Letterman thing. There aren't going to be 10 items, and I'm not going to go from 10 backwards. Number one, we don't like Coates. So why should we make him look good? So we'll screw him. And so if you grassroots people don't get what they want, too bad, we don't like Coates. Reason number two, and this is where I started to lose my temper. A person from a club, the name of which I will not identify, the lobbyist for a club national club that I won't identify said, we didn't want to support the Coates Amendment because that would be, quote, pandering to the NIMBYs. You like that? Pandering to the NIMBYs. We can't do that. Everybody knows what a NIMBY is, right? Not in my backyard. NIMBYs are people like the folks sitting here, folks who feel like maybe it's not too nice to get dumped on, and maybe they might say, like, I don't want it. You know, and that's supposed to be a sign of mental illness. Actually, I think NIMBY...
Is that pander or pamper?
Oh, pander, excuse me. Pandering to the NIMBYs. Right. Third reason for not supporting the Coates Amendment is that it's a Band-Aid approach. They think that it's a coincidence, or it's due to their grand logic or terrific lobbying skills, that we are now at a point in this country where we have changed the whole nature of the debate, and we've gotten industry to accept the fact that they'd better damn well reduce their waste, or else they're in big trouble, that Americans have to recycle. They have failed to accept the fact that because over the past 12 years you can't build any new waste sites, and that the toilet's been plugged up, and that industries had to suck on this stuff. They think that that to grant people the right to say no, the constitutional right to say no, to repeal the Dumpers Bill of Rights is somehow a Band-Aid approach. And finally, and this was where I really lost my temper, a lobbyist for a natural resources something group, which I will not identify, points his finger in my face, and he says, look, pal, people have got to earn the right to say no. And I pointed my finger back in his face and explained to him about some of our members back in Montana who ride around in those pickup trucks with the shotguns in the back, and what they might have to say about such things if had they had the chance to meet him personally. And then he stood up and I stood up, and Dan Weiss from the Sierra Club jumped in the middle, and that was sort of like the end of the meeting. By that they mean that in order to be able to say no, you have to meet some standard of environmental purity. In other words, you've got to have a perfect recycling and waste reduction plan in place, and all of your waste facilities have to meet the strictest possible state and federal standards and so forth. And then maybe, if you're nice and you ask politely, you might be granted the right to say no under this formula. Reason why I'm going through all of this, folks, is because we are now at a crossroads where the environmentalist plan to get a comprehensive RCRA reauthorization bill, a RCRA renewal bill that contains a comprehensive approach to dealing with our waste in a total and complete way, has collapsed. It has totally fallen apart. Both the House and the Senate are completely deadlocked, and it's been a classic example of everything that people have been complaining about in this country. You've got the president basically saying that I don't care what you pass, whatever you pass, I'm going to veto. And you've got both the House and the Senate passing bills in committee that are basically being reported out by those committees dead on arrival. There will be no RCRA renewal bill this year. What we will have a better than even shot at actually getting is, in fact, the repeal of the Dumpers Bill of Rights. We have the best shot ever of winning this thing. And we're almost there. I'm going to pass out a couple of things here. One is an action appeal from the leadership in my organization, which gives you some background and some of the details and the bill numbers and some specific action steps that need to be undertaken if we're going to bring this thing on home this year. There are very few days left for Congress to complete its work. Let me just give you a short sketch of what that is. Okay, it's now May 30th. And you know, the November election is, for all practical purposes, the end of Congress for this year. Okay? Because when they come back after the election, they'll meet for a little bit of time, but they won't pass anything because it's going to be a, quote, lame duck session. And nothing generally gets passed during a lame duck session. Congress does not work generally on Mondays and Fridays. They've got a 3-day work week, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and they will be out. Well, most of the major environmental congressmen, Congress folk are going to be gone for most of mid-June because they're going to go down to Rio, you know, to the Earth Summit and cavort around, you know, and sort of do Rio stuff for a couple of weeks. And they ain't going to do any business on anything environmental. From July 3rd to the 17th, they're going to recess because they got the convention coming at the, you know, the back end of this recess. Then from August 13th to September 7th, they're going to recess. This is how this works. I mean, I always used to laugh at this stuff when I was at CCHW. It's like, how does Washington really work? Well, that's like a stupid question on the face of it. It doesn't. And then they're gonna break on October 2nd for the election. So there's approximately maybe 15 or 20 working days available to us to pull this off. Believe it or not, I think we can do it. Senator Coates is ready to go. The stuff that's going around gives you the bill numbers. For those of you who like details, here's some stuff that details what's in Coates's bill, as well as what weird language ended up in the Senate version of the bill. You can ignore the last 2 pages unless you're sort of anal retentive and like looking at details like that. You can see how screwy the mainstream Senate is in dealing with the out-of-state waste issue. And don't ask me to make any sense out of it because it doesn't make any sense. But just to give you a sense of how Congress's mind works on this, you might want to read it for amusement. In the United States Senate, we will win the vote on this issue. Senator Coates is ready to go again and introduce his bill. He's currently projecting that he's got 70 votes in his pocket. The key target senator we've been working on with our friends and allies in Tennessee is Senator Al Gore. If Al Gore signs on, if he publicly supports the people's right to say no to out-of-state garbage, then the chances are that the vote in the Senate will be unanimous. That in fact it won't even come up for a vote. That what will happen is Senator Coates will introduce the bill and he'll get unanimous consent and that'll be it. Then it goes to the House, where you've got all manner of ways that the bill can be killed on procedural grounds. John Dingell, who is one of the strangest, most powerful guys in the Congress and most vicious guys in the Congress, is not with the program on this and is likely to find as many procedural and parliamentary tricks as he can find to keep this bill from being taken up. What we're advising folks to do in that action alert is to start contacting all of your members of Congress. On the Senate side, you've got some very specific bill numbers and bill language to ask Breaux and Johnson to support. And you've also got the Monroe waste management story to talk about because they know it very well. We've been in touch with both of those offices, and the first things that they talk about are, yeah, we've been hearing from a lot of people about the Monroe dumping problem. So they are very much hip to that issue. On the House side, again, contact all of the members. You don't necessarily have to give them a specific bill number, but what you should do is tell the Democrats to get in touch with Congressman Wayne Owens' office, and you should tell the Republicans to get in touch with Congressman John Myers' office, you know, because they like to travel in the same pack, right? Democrats are Democrats, Republicans are Republicans. John Myers is from Indiana. Wayne Owens is from Utah. And they're the ones who are going to be leading the floor fight to win the right to say no on the House side. The Senate bill is likely to move within the next 5 to 10 days. By the 4th of July, the Senate will probably have completed its work on the right to say no and sent it over to the House. On this issue, we have the capacity to move fast because we've got the votes. And we've also got the grassroots muscle to make this thing happen for the first time since the 1986 amendments to the Superfund Reauthorization Act. This is the first time in 6 years we've had as much accumulated power and the power to translate our force into changes in public policy. Between July 4th, well, actually July 17th and April 13th, that's going to be the crunch. That's going to be the time where if we're going to get stabbed in the back, it's likely to happen. And it's going to be very important that the members of the House of Representatives from the South are united and clear and on top of this thing, because it's going to be tricky. It's going to be very tricky. You're going to almost have to have a whole bunch of eyes and ears on the inside to figure out how tricky it's going to be. So I would give them the generic message of we've got to have the right to say no. And you know we want the right to say no, and it's our due, it's our time to get the right to say no. We've put 12 years this movement has fought for this, and it's our right. We have carried the environmental movement in this country on our backs for the past 12 years, and it's time that the grassroots movement got its just desserts. And to hell with this stuff about earning the right to say no. We have earned it. We've earned it through the kind of fights that where's Teresa? Teresa Robert spent 10 years of her life fighting one of the biggest proposed facilities that was ever proposed in this country. You know, there's folks in this room that know the kind of blood and sweat that's been put into this, and it's now our due. And the time is now. Yes, sir? You first and then Corinne.
What's Al Gore saying about this at this point?
We were blessed with the screwy language that came out of the Senate. Al Gore's staff person looked at the language that came out of the Senate, the second and third pages in that legislative language handout. And he looked at that stuff and he says, I don't believe this. This is the craziest stuff I ever saw. This isn't going to solve the problem. I'm going to recommend to my boss that he get on board. And that's where things are at with Gore. He needs a push, and the folks in Tennessee are working real hard on that. From end to end in the state of Tennessee, virtually every grassroots group is putting the pressure on Gore. They want it as bad as we do.
One of the bad things that happened recently, of course, with the national energy strategy was that they have now established a precedence of national sacrifice zones, which they have done in the state of Nevada, preempting the right of Nevada to look at high-level waste. And this kind of thing, we need to have the right within the state to say no, regardless. I mean, I'd like to see them revisit that at some point, because otherwise they may use that in this circumstance.
It is our intention to use the garbage, winning the right to say no to out-of-state garbage, as opening the wedge to dealing with rad waste and dealing with hazardous waste. Make no mistake about it, folks. I'm not going to try to tell you that this is going to be a blanket right to say no victory. That's not what we're going to win this year. You know, if we're going to win the right to say no this year on this initiative, it's going to be for garbage and garbage alone. But our members are committed to going back and getting the rest of it. But the first thing we've got to do is we've got to crack the Dumpers Bill of Rights. We've got to knock that sucker down and open the door for the rest of it. Corinne, and then you.
I have two questions. Are the national groups going to oppose?
They're going to stay neutral.
The last I heard, they're going to stay neutral. They decided to, after I nearly got into the fist fight, they decided that maybe it would be best not to make this an issue of contention and break up the harmony within the national groups.
My second question is, why is this unanimous consent? Why is it being sponsored by someone with whom we don't agree on other issues?
the beauty of this whole thing and the way that it's being reflected in the Senate, it is that it is a direct result of the power of the grassroots movement. Direct result of the power of the grassroots movement. If you take a look at the list of sponsors on the Coates bill, they cover the entire political range, from ultra-right-wing creeps to some pretty decent progressive senators, and a bunch of populists in the middle. You got Republicans, you got Democrats. It is truly amazing, and it is a total reflection of the power of the grassroots movement translated into a piece of public policy initiative.
The Coates did it out of
Pressure.
Out of pressure from the grassroots?
Total pressure.
Oh.
Absolute total pressure, because Indiana's a well-organized state. You were next, and then 2, 3, 4. Oh, and Lorena's telling me to shut up pretty soon. Oh, how much? Okay. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Go ahead.
Could somebody give us a quick spiel to give to our representatives about the Monroe situation? I mean, a quick,
Okay, what's happening there? Somebody want to take a shot? Anybody here from Monroe? Or knows that situation well enough to do that? Willie? 30-second wrap starting now.
Sure. You've got EPA trying to dump waste on solid waste landfill, saying that it's not hazardous waste, but it is hazardous in Dallas. It's not hazardous elsewhere in the solid waste landfill. And it's interstate shipment. The state of Louisiana and local governments in Louisiana and Texas are fighting to continue dumping the number of dump sites. Congressmen and senators in Louisiana are terrified that it's the first time something's happened in Northeast Louisiana environmental.
and it's supposed to be Superfund waste as well.
Yeah, it's Superfund waste in Dallas, but it becomes municipal waste once it crosses the border.
Plus it's waste.
And if it doesn't deal with hazardous waste, it's solid waste, this is its bill.
Now, who was number 2?
Go ahead.
No, I'm real curious what your opinion is of working on legislation now, after leaving the situation.
Still very jaded. I hate it. I had a notorious bad attitude about Washington and the national groups and legislation and so forth when I was at CCHW. I was too kind when I was at CCHW. It's even worse. Yeah, it's incredible. It makes me sick. And if that was all I did, I would have left that job like February 3rd. But there is more to it, and that's mainly like focus. When we can well, Lorena, if you'll indulge me on running over about 2 seconds. What is organizing about? I mean, organizing is about building power. Ultimately, we organize our power and run through 4 stages there's 4 stages of getting power through organizing. The first stage is when they recognize you, when they acknowledge that you actually exist. Okay, when they accept the fact that you just bit their ankle, okay? That's the first level of power. The second level of power is when they're willing to sit down and make a deal with you. That's the second level. The third level of power is when you can make the deal stick, when they can't screw you after you've left the table. The fourth level of power is where you can change institutions. When you can actually, I mean, this is the stage that I call, this is when we take over, okay? When we reach the point, as we did in 1986, where we were the only ones who came out of the Superfund process with things like community right to know, technical assistance grants, and a bunch of other stuff, we were the only ones who got anything. Why? Because we were working our way through this process, and we were like right in this stage here, where we were about to start changing institutions. Over these past 12 years, our movement has been moving in this direction, and now comes the time where we cash in. And my feeling is that when you have those opportunities dangling in front of you to cash in on your power, on what you've been organizing for, take it, because it's yours. You've earned it. Who was number 3?
When you hear some of these people complain about earning the right to say no, and you nature Nazis complain too much, it's 2 words, and you take back out, First Amendment.
Right.
Just a quick comment. My daughter lives in Dallas, and I talked to her last night, and she said, "Mother, how can Louisiana say no, and they're going to put it, EPA's saying we have to put it in these 2 little towns up here near me?"
Camille's backyard.
Yeah,
It's okay.
all of a sudden she woke up.
Yeah. I mean, that is the problem, isn't it? I mean, but we can't solve the problem by playing a shell game.
Right. It's
I mean, ultimately, it's got to come down to, like, we've all got to deal with the waste where it is. And as Lyndon Johnson said, don't spit in the soup, we've all got to eat it. Hal, you were number 4, and you get the last word.
Representative Wayne
Owens.
Is there a representative?
Yes, Representative Wayne Owens of Utah would be the Democratic contact, and John Myers, M-Y-E-R-S.
They're both representatives, and don't worry about who Johnston to talk to, because he won't talk to anybody anyway.
Johnston is going to be in the conference committee negotiating eventually. No, wait a minute. What?
This is Ricker.
Yeah, okay, on RCRA. Yeah, talk to Johnston about supporting the Senate bills.
Uh-huh.
Okay. On the
HR what? You're going to give us those numbers?
you got the numbers on
We can get
that action
Bro
alert.
and talk to us
That's
about
right,
it.
with Bro and Johnston.
I thought Bro was on the waste management side.
Not on this issue. Because we've got the power, and it's up to us to cash it in.
Take it.
Yeah, it's our time. Sorry for running over, Lorena.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That backs up a statement I heard once, that you don't have power until you can elect someone else.
Is Indiana Citizen Action support on this?
Yep.
We just changed 6 of 9 finished juries in the last election, and we will do it.
Christine Ressler, I used to be with Food and Water. I talked to you a few times. Now I'm in King. I really liked your talk. I hate legislation.
Yeah. I like winning more than I like legislation.
But you know, it's one of the reasons I asked that question is because it's such a bind, you know.
Your team is bringing out 10 seconds.
Philosophy of don't bother.